Good morning and welcome. You're welcome to another Bevington Group webinar, albeit Bevington Group is transitioning to the brand name Strategic Design by Argon & Co, as we have not that long ago joined the Argon Group, the Argon & Co Group. So more of that in the future because it does extend our service line a bit. But today we are going to be talking about change and adaptability in leadership. And the reasoning for this is all to do with the pace of change, which I will talk about first. But even before I get started on the meat for this particular webinar, I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the lands from which I'm presenting today. I'm in Sydney, so it's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. All right, we'll make a start. First of all, why this particular webinar? Well, in the conversations I've been having with many leaders, it's sometimes been the case that we start talking about how fast things seem, and it often seems fast, but there's something special about this particular period of time. Is it the changes in the economy? Is it the problems in the Straits of Hormuz? Or is it AI? Is it all of the above? Is it fractions in certain markets? I think it is all of the above. But it feels like a race. So we thought it was appropriate to pause and think about what's going on. And this particular webinar can be looked at least in tandem with another one that we did earlier. And for those who are interested, we're happy to send it out, but it is on our website. And that particular webinar is about personal resilience. It's very handy at times like this. But let's get into it. So we're going to talk about a term which I believe was first coined by Gartner, actually, which is the era of ungovernable change. It's not quite as disastrous as it sounds, but it certainly feels that way. Then we'll talk about how does a leader keep pace with change? What are the frameworks that apply? And how do leaders show visibility in terms of their own adaptation skills? Because leaders cast a very long shadow. So we're going to go through these three today. But first of all, this fantastic term, the era of ungovernable change. Well, the idea here comes from Velnosky et al., which is a paper that came out of the Harvard Business Review quite recently. Unbelievably timely, because it's not just in Australia that we're feeling the pace of change. And it talks about differences in how change feels right now. And they do mention that it feels like a race. But they say there are 4 reasons for this feeling of being more under pressure than before. First is the changes are stacked. So the changes layer one on top of the other with no time to pause and absorb the change that's happened before the next shift happens. So it's stacked one after another. They're continuous. So they're stacked and there's no gap between the stacks either. So they're layered on top of one another, multiple things happening at once with no gap. They're sometimes, and indeed often, interdependent. So you're doing one change that, if it goes wrong, affects the ability to deliver the next change. So interdependency. And externality. So a lot of it's driven externally. Now, this has often been the case, but it seems more so. So if you require oil prices to be at a certain level, or energy prices generally to be at a certain level, to be able to deliver your particular product or service, then it would have been a particularly disruptive time. If you're an agribusiness getting fertilizer, it would have been a particularly disruptive time. They're externalities. And you can even argue that AI is an externality in the sense that there is a feeling across many organizations that you've really got to be in it. You will be left behind if you're not, perhaps personally, perhaps professionally, but certainly organizationally. Externally driven change. So sitting down, doing a 3-year plan with your programs neatly laid out with gaps in between to recover and pause and allow for some absorption does seem to many like a thing of the past. So another paper produced by Solomon et al. Recently talked about some of the drivers of volatility, because some of this feeling of always on change, even more so than it has been, I've been talking about this for a long time, seems even more extreme. So why? Well, policy volatility. Well, one of the things that's happened in the last few years is policy by tweet, for example. Tariffs, for example, even regulatory change, immigration rules, but this is particularly in the US, can all seem like policy by tweet. I'll go to the right-hand side, geopolitical fragmentation. I think we're all aware of that. But even AI infiltration can introduce volatility. So AI itself is leapfrogging, various forms of AI are leapfrogging each other in terms of their progress. And the changes that happened in this AI world themselves can seem quite hard to keep up with because the progress that's happening is so very fast. So again, this adds to that feeling of being overwhelmed. So how do humans respond to this sense of always on change and volatility? Well, in three key ways. Well, if the brain senses this volatility, this always on change as a threat, um, it can go into a form of overload. So it can narrow its focus. It can basically pay attention to dangers rather than opportunities, and it can leave little room for creativity. And we do need to notice new opportunities, and we do need to be creative often to be able to solve the problems that all this always on change presents. So we can slip into firefighting mode. So we can rush to fix what's urgent and actually miss what's very important. So we're trading short-term sense of progress for potentially longer-term gain. So we're missing what's important. And as we said just beforehand, we might not have the room for creativity. And of course, it's actually possible that we can freeze up. And what that actually looks like is often delay. So we actually delay decisions, and sometimes we delay decisions saying, oh, well, actually, I'll just wait for more information. Now, if any of you had paid attention, and I'm sure you were, but if any of you had noticed that we had that presentation earlier on personal resilience, we talk about reframing, and reframing is where there are many things happening. You can see it as a threat or you can see it as an opportunity. So reframing what's happening as an opportunity can help address this. It can actually stop the threat response or ameliorate or modify this threat response before you get started. So it's well worth looking at that. And reframing is simply seeing or explaining to yourself what's happening in a different way. So the always on is not without consequences for good decision making. And that's really what this paper is saying. So Russell Reynolds also issued a very interesting piece of insight in their paper in 2025. And it talks about, well, what about responding to this change? So we can sit and quietly watch it basically walk past us, but we do have to do something as leaders. So they talked about different types of inertia, and I thought this was extremely valuable. There's insight inertia, psychological inertia, and action inertia. So lots of change. We have to do something about it. Let's say we manage to get ourselves sorted, and getting ourselves sorted, I think, largely involves reframing. So we see the change as opportunity, not threat, and have a great deal of confidence that we'll be able to cope. Now, how we lead our teams to be able to feel that way is another matter, and we'll come to that shortly. But what do we do now? Okay, so three types of inertia. Insight inertia means exactly that. So effectively, no new insights beyond that which the organization already has. And organizations operate on all sorts of assumptions about how the way the world is. In fact, it's sometimes what we do when we're doing strategy work is assess what leadership think is their model, but also how leadership thinks the way the world works. Now, insight inertia really happens when a leader has an insight that's different, that might be better aligned to the realities of the environment that they're in. So it kind of has an organization evolutionary advantage. So, but the rest of the organization doesn't necessarily see it the same way yet. And often an error happens or a problem happens when a leader has an insight, assumes that everyone else sees it too. And in fact, that's just not the case. Insight inertia is real. And the challenge here is if you're going to drive a change, as I've highlighted there, without a felt need across the system, i.e. everyone gets the same idea and believes it's probably true, Initiatives can fail not because people are actively resistant, they just don't think it's important enough. There's narrative drift, there's fading interest, and so not much happens. So if there is a new insight, it does need to be held broadly enough for change to happen. Then there's psychological inertia. And one of them, there are really a couple of ways this happens. One of the ways is mentioned down the bottom, which is fear. So fear freezes us. And we mentioned that a little bit before when we were talking about response to the threats that might be perceived in the always on change. But there are other psychological mechanisms at work. So if you have been, or your teams have been, or your middle managers have been, or anyone in your organization's been running a particular way and using, say, a particular way of working, or a particular set of technologies, or a particular set of processes, or a particular set of training, whatever it happens to be in your operating model, and then are told this ain't going to work anymore, that can create cognitive dissonance. You're sure it's going to work, you sort of believe that there's an issue, that change has to happen, but there's a dissonance because you also deeply believe that the system works. So cognitive dissonance is the problem of holding two opposite ideas in your head at the same time. And that creates stress and distress that might actually add to the feelings of tension that arise because you're already overloaded. And I would say psychological inertia is more likely, I think, when in overload mode. So another thing that will potentially stop action. And then there's action inertia itself. And this is when organizations are actually designed, either in terms of process, ways of working, financial structures, even culture and base assumptions, to actually hold to the status quo. The organization's almost designed to not change. So it's hard for it to shift to what really needs to be a much more agile approach to dealing with this ungovernable change era. So action inertia is another thing. So this could be very, very slow planning processes, slow resource allocation, slow ability to hire the right staff, slow ability to transform or change systems, slow ability to get risk authorization, whatever it happens to be. There are many, many ways that an organization can stymie change. And the hypothesis underlying the presentation of this slide is with the always on change that we've got, we actually do need to be very agile. And we'll talk more about how you get your teams to be that little bit more agile as we go. But it is useful to think, and I've certainly found it useful to think about which type of inertia is applying with our clients and which type of inertia is actually even applying to us, because we've all got spots of inertia in our organizations. So ungovernable change, you've got this stacked and continuous problem that's happening or opportunity that's happening. Well, how do you deal with it? Well, one theory is that the old approach of rallying people to an end state that's clearly defined and that you can be quite confident, or at least reasonably confident, that you can get to by very clear and careful planning and great programs of work that won't be disrupted, is no longer true. So what could you do in this world? And I'll pause for thought and say, we're still going to need large programs and we're still going to need well-planned programs. It's just there's an awful lot of things happening around it. So how do you cope? What do leaders do? Well, you could point to the light in the hill, which is what used to happen. And there's certainly circumstances when that's useful. But going back to the first folks we talked about, Velnosky et al., and it was their particular program or their particular paper that got us down this track. Leaders need to shift from a destination to a journey. So rather than talk about a far off destination, switch to talk about the risks of standing still, the benefits of keeping moving, and the value of small, steady, visible changes, visible wins that take us inevitably to a better place. So basically, talk about the small stuff, talk about the progress, talk about the steady wins that progress as you go, and point out that it's a little bit too risky to stand still at this point in time. So why do that? Well, the main reason for doing that is that metric to the left, where it was found that in this particular survey, many people just didn't trust that we'd ever get to the light and the hill. They never trusted that we'd get to that end state. So if nearly 80% of personnel are thinking, not really sure we'll get to that light and hill, maybe it's time to think about a different form of communication. Now, I don't think this applies in all cases, but I do think it's worthwhile thinking about, particularly if this metric is even close to true in yourself, the 80%, 79% metric. Think about a different form of communication. Now, I will point out here something that I often point out, which is there's a form of communication in change that's particularly valuable, and it avoids the Pollyanna, everything will be okay under all circumstances type of thing. The reality here is that you can say, this will be hard, this will be difficult, and we'll still be okay. And that's a communication style that's particularly useful when everybody's busy and everyone's feeling overloaded. But we'll come to some different techniques for dealing with that as well. So leaders getting through to staff by basically celebrating those small wins. Okay. So let's think a little bit more about how leaders keep pace with change. So one of the theories behind all of this emerging school of thought on always on change, and this one comes from Lyons 2025, is that big bursts of enthusiasms around one-off events won't quite cut it going forward. And in fact, what will really help is the emotional regulation that comes through a drumbeat. So basically building a handful of skills and practices that are built into everyday work and that deliver a drumbeat of change. Now, all of this helps with emotional regulation. Now, in this slide, we reference something called SCARF, and I'm just going to talk about this because I've never talked about SCARF before. And SCARF is a model that relates to emotional regulation, and it's useful to have as a leader when leading either teams large or small. So what this does is help you identify the cause or causes of fear in your organization. Now, one of it just might be overload, but overload tends to be a driver that leads to different types of fear, or accentuates different types of fear. So SCARF stands for status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. I'll go to this slide now, and I'll come back to this other slide. So what this is saying is, as a leader with all of this always on change, what you can actually do is pause and think about in your teams or even individuals who you're responsible for, you're coaching, you're mentoring, you develop, you're caring for. What is their potentially primary fear that arises? Is it that the changes will lead to a loss of status? Is it that the changes will do what appears to be happening at the moment, decrease certainty? Is it that the changes will lead to a reduced sense of autonomy? Is it that the changes will reduce relatedness, a feeling of connection that helps us feel safe? We feel safer if we're connected to people. And in fact, there's a very good evolutionary reason for that. And is it that there's a loss of sense of fairness? Now, the thing about fear, and the reason for pausing and talking about this in this ungovernable era, is that fear is accentuated when you're actually running really hard all the time and your energy battery is low. So it might actually be very useful for leaders not just to understand it, but name it, talk to it, and address it. In cognitive behavioral therapy, what's actually done in that particular way of thinking is actually make conscious or make explicit a thought which may actually be irrational and replace it with a better thought. We've talked about this in the resilience slides on reframing. So we may have to reframe what's happening to address this fear or accept, for example, yes, we are really in a period of less certainty, but you know what, we're okay. And here are the reasons we're okay, and here are the reasons that we can cope. But it's difficult to message and lead your teams effectively if you don't know what fear you're trying to address. And of course, you'll be addressing simple overload and exhaustion as well. So as a leader, you've got your own emotional regulation, go to the resilience packs, but also for your teams, you're thinking about what are the fears that I actually probably need to think about, address, message, and help my team reframe. Um, Context setting. Another thing that leader could do is not shield the team from what's coming per se, not pretend everything's okay. Teams very, very quickly see through that. Not pretend that there will be a pause and a fabulous rest, although rest is very important. And I'm going to close the presentation on how to build in rest, but help them actually lean into and explore it. Help them understand that the change is not to be feared, but to be understood, and help them understand that you collectively have the flexibility and adaptability to even deal with the unknowns. So we said that one change that you might consider is not pointing to the mountaintop you're going to climb in 5 years' time, but stress the early wins and of course stress the ability to cope. This also applies. Help them understand what's coming so that it is less frightening. And of course, celebrate those micro moments of change. Another thing that can help your team and in fact your whole enterprise deal with this always on environment where actually there are a lot of those externalities. You'll remember that one of the fourth driver of this era of ungovernable change is those externalities. The things that happen externally is to actually set up some systems to actually note what they are and not knee jerk. So the problem with being overloaded is you might be more tense. The leadership team might be more tense, and you can have a knee-jerk reaction to something that happens in the environment when actually no reaction was required at all. Just sit. The question is deciding when a reaction happens and when not. So here's a way to think about it as leaders and indeed as individuals. You have a weekly policy desk. Legal, finance, HR, etc. get together and decide what's happened, what is happening, and is there anything we need to respond to. Then you've clear triggers. So you might decide in advance what warrants a response, e.g., if a tariff basically exceeds a certain threshold, then that might warrant a response. If it doesn't, you might do very little. And keep your options open. So don't do all or nothing bets, but ask if you can do something small so you can learn and then move on to the next stage. Now, we generally don't recommend ossification. I don't just sit and watch the change, but have an understanding that not all change will be permanent. So set triggers and also think about options. So placing small bets. And I've talked about options in the past, real options that you can take. All right. So how do you show adaptability? And the premise behind this is leaders cast a long shadow. So if you can demonstrate that you're being adaptable, it's actually very helpful. So how do you think about that? Well, visible adaptability rests on a number of different pillars, and this comes from Lyons again. And the things or the attributes you might want to think about demonstrating are agility, your ability to pivot quickly to a new problem and lead the team in creatively coming up with solutions to that problem. So that's agility. Agility also implies that you're not stuck in yesterday's way of doing things. So role modeling that is particularly helpful and important. If you can focus on building this skill itself, this psychologists often call cognitive flexibility. That's actually a skill that's actually is learnable, but cognitive flexibility is also associated with good mental health generally. Resilience, staying calm and focused. Now, this doesn't mean you have to be an automaton or a robot. What it really means is that you can say, gee, this is hard, but we can cope. And that you can stay calm and focus and lead the team to real problem solving and foresight. Now, really what you're doing is you're demonstrating that you're looking over the horizon. So questions to ask yourself, am I demonstrating that I'm looking over the horizon for early signs of disruption? Am I demonstrating that even though I might show signs of stress, none of us are perfect, the reality is that you can actually keep your head in a crisis. And even though there might be a sense of tension in the room, help guide the team towards what needs to be done. And you're agile. You're not stuck in yesterday's way of doing things, and you can pivot to solving a different set of problems than you were solving last week. So going back to Velnosky, they have something to say in this, and they talk about turning your personal adaptability, because many of you will actually have natural adaptation capabilities, and in fact, probably more than you think. We tend to underestimate our ability to adapt. So one of the things you want to do is turn foresight into a team reflex by actually talking about what's coming. Ask the team members themselves to track the forces that are shaping the organization and talk about it, a new regulation, a new AI tool, and teach the group what they've found. I'm sure many of you learn lots and lots of things from your team members, and I'm sure that I do value it enormously. And one of the great places this is in the age of AI, when you can learn things from each other very, very quickly, because it's a rapidly changing space. Be careful of your language. So imagining how you receive, or how what you say could be received, is very, very useful. So to basically, you want to be seen not as protecting the past, but as embracing the future and figuring out effectively how you can actually make it work for you. So sort of questions like, what could we gain if we reimagined this? Or what could we gain from this environmental change? What if we started fresh today? What would we do differently? And certainly the changes, and asking what could we get out of the changes, not just what could go wrong. They're important questions to ask. So you don't switch off your risk lens. You can say what can go wrong, but how can we use it to our advantage is a different sort of question, a different sort of framing, and turns on different circuits of the brain. And of course, if you are uncomfortable, be honest about it. But it's always, this is hard, but we can do this. You're encouraging people to believe this is hard, but I can do this. Now, it is important in all of this to care for people, but you can still hold them accountable. And this is, of course, the eternal paradox of leadership. And what we would say, it's particularly important, though, in caring for people during this period where change is always on, to understand the underlying fears. So this is this scarf model that we rather like, because in periods of tension, in periods of overload, in periods of stress for an elongated period of time, fears can be accentuated and they don't necessarily help. So it's very important to think about that. But you still have to hold the line on performance. Now I'm going to pause here and go off slides for a couple of minutes just to talk about, though, individual stress and rest. Now in the resilience pack, we have talked about Taleb, and Taleb is the author of Black Swan. He wrote a book on anti-fragility, and broadly speaking, you can think of anti-fragility as the state of being where, when a system, organization, team, or person or organism is stressed, it gets stronger as a result of the stress. So anti-fragile is under pressure or under conditions of volatility and change, actually. This particular system gets better. So let's say it's your organization, or let's say it's you personally. There is a feature of this particular theory that talks about stress and rest. So yes, there's always on change. Yes, they're continuous, they're stacked, they're externally driven and more. But the reality is you actually, as a leader, still need to make space for your teams. So this is consciously basically ensuring that people get holidays, that actually you build in micro breaks for people. Now, Australia has this wonderful thing called the public holiday. You could use that. You could use other forms of micro break. You can encourage teams to take micro breaks during the day. You can insist that managers have blocked out times in their calendars that are simply reflection, reading, or thinking times. And you actually insist, and you certainly need to insist for yourself. But one enormous warning sign is no one's getting the time to take their holidays. So your leave balances don't just matter financially, they actually matter from an organizational resilience perspective. So even though in aggregate for your team or your organization, things are always on, And even though you can reframe it to see all of this as exciting and as making you stronger as a person and making your organization stronger, and all of that can very much be true, it's still important to understand that your organization will only get stronger if you consciously build in the rest. So what you're actually doing, this is why we've linked this to the resilience packs, is basically ensuring that stress and rest happens. Now, we think the rest needs to happen intraday, so breaks and including pauses and thinking breaks, intra-week, intra-month, and intra-year. And of course, intra-year is the classic annual leave day or days or weeks. So all of that's very important, and you're supporting that because it's good in a humanist sense. You're a decent human being and you're making sure your people are great, and looking after your people just happens to be good business too. Okay. So hold the line on performance, but hold the line on the performance, it plays in that context of that stress and rest piece. And that's why we say this, leaders should protect vision time. Vision time is that time where you really are liberating yourself to be more creative. Because right at the beginning, we said that one of the things that can arise under conditions of always on change is accentuated fear, and indeed just the sense of overload and burnout can narrow focus and reduce creativity. So popping times in, this is a form of stress and rest, but it's also a form of creativity and problem solving time. So block it. You might actually want to leave the building for this. At other times, actually, we actually think it's important for leaders to be physically present. But this might be a special space where you make time, and it's not copping out. It's extremely important for your ongoing performance. So block it and mean it, and potentially keep the what clear of the how. So you might be thinking on a Tuesday of the what and a Thursday of the how. It's a neat trick. And you're really modeling from the top. So you're actually demonstrating that you're taking time out from 22 meetings a day and actually doing something like thinking space. So that pause for thought, that rest and reflection. And so having made that point, it's worthwhile now moving on to the summary. So I've used the term ungovernable change, which it certainly didn't create, was mentioned in the literature that we've been discussed, mentioned by Gardner, but it is an extreme couple of words. Of course, it actually is somewhat governable, but what really is meant is it's not governable in the traditional sense of being able to plan everything out and progressing to an objective or a goal with certainty. And one of the key reasons is the goal will change because there's so much changing around us. You'll actually change the hill you're heading to. So therefore, we're proposing that you're aware of it, that you're aware of the impacts of it, that you're aware of the impacts on yourself, your teams, and fear responses in your teams, that you're aware that you might need to communicate differently, that you're aware that it's worthwhile actually connecting back into the resilience material we've talked about before, both for you and your teams, and that you're aware in that resilience frame that stress and rest is important, including the time to protect your own time, that you're very much aware that you're not just regulating your own emotion, but that you cast the long shadow, and that you're regulating team emotions as well to an extent. So therefore, you shouldn't understand things like SCARF or an alternative, but we like SCARF. And that you're demonstrating adaptation. You're demonstrating, for example, that stress and rest response. You're demonstrating agility, you're demonstrating resilience, and you're demonstrating foresight. So it's a slightly shorter presentation today. We don't need to go all the way to 9 this morning, but I do hope that you found this extremely useful. This will be posted online so that you've got access to the slides. If you search on our website, you should be able to find the resilience pack as well as this pack. They are something of a twin. And if you can't, feel free to email us either at ceo@bevingtongroup.com or at webinar@bevingtongroup.com. And if you've any questions, also feel free to email us on webinar@bevingtongroup.com. And there it is on the screen now. And that's all for now. Thank you very much, everyone.